The modern Scandinavian languages include Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic and Faroese, and are the result of the evolution of the ancient Viking language, also known as Old Norse. In fact, the modern Scandinavians are the direct descendants of the Vikings, a people of Germanic origin, the people of whom Tacitus spoke in the Germania. The term Viking means man of sea inlets, and this word denotes explorers, merchants, and Norse warriors, all of Scandinavian origin, who set sail on stout wooden ships, the imposing dragger, and scourged the shores of the British Isles, France, and other parts of Europe. From the 8th to the 11th century, highly capable ocean voyagers and fierce warriors, in the Middle Ages these belligerent people of the cold gave birth to a very important civilization. Feared all around Europe because of their cruelty, these bloody and ruthless people of the north are believed to have discovered America many centuries before Christopher Columbus, where they established a short-lived settlement called Finland on the island of Newfoundland, which indeed was the very first European colony overseas. They also discovered other lands hitherto completely unexplored, which at those times were imagined rather than explored territories, such as Iceland, known by the Latin authors as Thule, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. Greenland in particular was discovered almost by chance by Eric the Red, who decided to give this name to this huge island of ice in order to encourage future colonist settlements. Displacements of Vikings' colonies were often dictated by the lack of arable land and by a dearth of natural resources necessary to sustain a satisfactory life. We must keep in mind that Scandinavia was for the most part a difficult region, almost entirely covered by forest, an unproductive land of mountains, lakes, rivers and ice. The Vikings are also known as the inventors of the runes, large blocks of stone with mysterious incised inscriptions of various sorts. For years, the runes were seen as magical sources of wisdom and power of all sorts. At present, however, the consensus is that runic inscriptions did not really have magical component, but were short epigraphic inscriptions which contain maxims as well as fragments of a juridical character. At any rate, the runes are a literary record of considerable importance, as they supply information about the uses and the customs of a shadowy historical era. As we have already mentioned, the Viking rule also extended to the British Isles. Their language influenced the English tongue since the very beginning of its history, which from Old English up to the present day has preserved a very large number of Old Norse words. Therefore, one ought not to be surprised if some Nordic words sound familiar to Anglophones. The striking likeness between Old Norse and Old English is epitomized by the ancient Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. Beowulf is an epic poem of pagan origin and was written by an anonymous author and is clear proof of this linguistic influence on the English language. As for the Viking religion, it was polytheistic. Odin, the arch-god of the Vikings, his wife Freya, and Thor, the god who used the thunderbolt and lightning, similar to Jupiter or Zeus, are just a few names of divinities of the Nordic pantheon, and it is curious to point out that the days of the week in the Germanic languages were named after them. Nowadays, the situation is slightly different. If originally it was the Viking language that influenced English, today we are experiencing a quite opposite trend. The background of the Scandinavian languages doesn't only include the Viking heritage. Scandinavia has been a crossroad of people who influenced its language and culture. In fact, after the Middle Ages, the Nordic vocabulary absorbed many foreign words coming from other European languages. Firstly, there were the Germans with the Hanseatic League who dominated the Scandinavian scene. afterwards the Dutch and the Walloons merchants. However, we should not forget the influence of the French language, which has significantly modified the Nordic lexicon. In fact, between the 17th and the 18th century, there was an important cultural exchange between France and Scandinavia. France was seen as a country of culture and was admired because of the court life of its sovereigns, for their elegant and refined style, as well as for its intelligentsia. In the same way, French was considered the preeminent language of truly cultured people. Thus, the French one became a model to follow. Among the French philosophers of that age, René Descartes stood particularly out among the other ones. He became the protégé of the Queen Christine of Sweden and was persuaded by that sovereign lady to move to Sweden, where he became a point of reference. However, not being accustomed to the severe Nordic winter, he took sick and died of pneumonia in Stockholm, almost forgotten and overlooked by the Queen herself, who at the beginning had showed such a great enthusiasm. The cultural back and forth between Scandinavia and France continued into the 18th century. The so-called Libertine period, amply celebrated in the Fredmans Epistlar by Carl Michael Bellman. It is no surprise that a large number of French words and therefore an abundance of Romance language words came into the Nordic vocabulary, supplanting the corresponding expressions of German origin. This phenomenon is quite apparent in language belonging to the sphere of gastronomy, since some foods were completely absent in Scandinavia and had to be imported on account of the Nordic frigid climate. Many Swedish, Norwegian and Danish foods, for instance, have a nomenclature of French origin. Today's Vikings, and above all their language, have slightly changed. Apart from Icelandic and Faroese, which have remained virtually unaltered, Swedish, Norwegian and Danish have radically changed throughout the years and have been considerably simplified. Although in the past these Nordic people were considered as destroyers, belligerent barbarians and bloody warriors to avoid at any cost, today's Scandinavians have contrariwise given birth to one of the most civilized and developed societies in the world. One only has to think of the many eminent personalities and intellectuals born in Scandinavia, such as Alfred Nobel, whose name is closely linked to the famous International Prize. Carl von Linné invented the so-called taxonomy system aimed at classifying human beings. Hans Christian Andersen, the author of popular fairy tales such as The Little Mermaid and The Ugly Duckling. Karen Blixen, whose novel The African Farm inspired a successful film starring Meryl Streep and Robert Redford. Henrik Ibsen, August Strindberg, among the main representatives of the European theatre of naturalism. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who can be considered as the precursor of existentialism. The Norwegian Edvard Munch, considered as the painter of the inner torment and despair. Astrid Lindgren, who gave birth to the famous Pippi Longstocks. And Selma Lagerlöf, awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1909. We should also keep in mind other famous personalities belonging to the world of the music, such as the ABBA, the Ace of Base, the Swedish duo Roxette, or the Icelandic singer Björk. Scandinavia doesn't only stand out in cultural terms. These countries can actually count on a strong economy and on a widespread wealth. Important international brands such as IKEA, Volvo, Saab and Lego have in fact contributed to increase the popularity of these countries worldwide. As far as the job market is concerned, the Scandinavian languages have also great potential. Knowing a Scandinavian language can actually be an advantage for those who work in the interpretation and translation sector. In addition to this, the natural beauty and the landscapes of these countries have always attracted the other Europeans, something which often results in interesting linguistic exchanges supported by intercultural programs such as the Erasmus. The affinity between these people has no correspondence elsewhere in the world, and the same is true for the languages of these countries, which are a cultural heritage of inestimable value, which must be protected.